Hello.
Hi, Dr. Baron. This is Alan Reed.
How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for making time for me. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome.
And I also wanted to just let you know I really enjoyed Words on Screen and Always On. I just flew through those, and we are completely simpatico with. I'm an educator as well, and so it really helps put things into perspective for me.
I'm so glad they're useful.
And I have similar research interests as well. So the reason that I'm calling you today is, as I indicated in my questions that I sent you, is I'm authoring a book on smartphone dependency. And a lot of what you talk about does resonate with what I'm talking about in the book.
Right.
And so I was hoping maybe you could elaborate on some things. My first question was about the convincing argument that you make for using different media for different purposes as different tools. And I was hoping you could speak specifically to smartphones in terms of their ability to impact reading and writing or understanding and comprehending on those types of devices.
Okay, now you just threw in writing, and that's something else I can speak to. But let's start with reading first. Probably the most important thing to keep in mind is that not all users of smartphones have the same background as readers, have the same interest in what they are reading. So it's important not to overgeneralize, as most of us sometimes tend to do, that everybody does this or the device makes you do that. There's an article, if you don't know about, you might want to look at, by the journalist Clive Thompson.
Yes.
Called Reading War and Peace on My iPhone. Have you come upon the piece?
I've heard reference to it. I've not seen it yet. I've read some other stuff by Clive Thompson.
Definitely read it. You can find it just by putting in Clive, C-L-I-V-E, Thompson, Reading War and Peace on My iPhone. It will pop up on your screen. It was published in an online venue called Book Riot.
Okay.
What he argues is you can read anything you want if you have a context for doing it. So when I think it was his son, was very young, and he would have to sit in his son's room until his child went to sleep because the child didn't want to go to sleep, and somebody was there. He said, okay, I could read on my phone. Now, Clive Thompson has written a number of books. He's a really smart journalist, and he knows how to read an awful lot of things. So when he comes to reading on his smartphone, he's coming with a mindset that's very different from that of most people. And what you'll see when you look at the piece is he didn't cut off his internet connection, because in Reading War and Peace, there are lots of pieces of history that he wanted to look up. So there was Wikipedia, and it worked fine. But then he immediately got right back to his text. What he did was he shut off all alerts. You know, there's an incoming text, there's an incoming, status update from someone or whatever. So he could just focus on his reading. If you know how to read and you really care, I'm reasonably, I didn't say totally, but reasonably convinced you can understand as much on a smartphone as you can in a large print text. But you have to come with a set of expectations. You have to come with a background. You have to come being willing to shut out the rest of the world, except when you want to pull a piece of information, but then know yourself that you're getting right back to the book. So Thompson is the exception, but he's not the only exception out there. The vast majority of people, when they are reading on a smartphone, are reading the kinds of things that don't require a lot of attention. So, as I don't have to tell you, they're reading news feeds and short articles and text messages, and they're on their social networks. And, this is what I call one-off reading, where you're going through it once and you're not looking to be tested on it afterwards. You're not looking to reread it. You're coming with a different set of assumptions about what's important to you in that text. So if I am reading on my phone an article in the New York Times because I'm standing in line at an airport waiting to board, and I don't want to lose my place in line because I want to get my luggage up there in the overhead bin. Mm-hmm. This actually happened to me on Friday night, so it's very real in my life.
Fresh in your mind.
Then if I'm interrupted with a beep on my phone, I come back to the article later. If I don't, it's okay, unless it were a really important article. So I think that one has to think about functionality, what one is reading for, before one just passes judgment on the instrument.
Right.
And to a significant extent, at least up until now, for most people, the reading that's done is not reading that we're looking to have deep understanding of.
Right, and I threw a curveball in there with the writing as well, and I know that's
okay. But I'd love to talk about writing even briefly, because I did a study with a colleague in Australia where we asked university students, we asked them in Australia, and then we asked them in the United States. The Australia data are analyzed. The American data we've just looked at, but we haven't actually analyzed. And we asked them about what it meant to write on a smartphone, on a computer, and by hand. And they said to us, you're not writing when you're, quotes, writing on a smartphone. That's texting, or that's emailing, or that's, doing Facebook, or that's whatever. That's not really what writing is about. Writing is about having, complete sentences and paragraphs and shuffling them around and having ideas that you want to expound. So that there's a perception that it's a very different phenomenon to be writing in the traditional sense of the term from the kind of inputting we do on smartphones. I'll also mention there was a study done 2008, I want to say it came out. Do you know the Pew Internet research?
Of course.
Work? Okay, it used to be Pew Internet and American Life Project,
yes,
and then that became part of Pew Internet Research. There's a study done by Amanda Lenhart and some other people asking American teenagers about writing. And we were talking about computers then rather than smartphones largely, but they would say, what I do in things like social networking, that's not writing. Writing's what I do in school.
Mm-hmm.
This is not writing. So there's a mindset that's really quite different in doing online communication in general, and then for more recent studies, doing it on a smartphone as to what counts as writing and what doesn't. What's going to be really interesting is as an increasing number of particularly colleges and universities are saying, we want everything that is educational on our website or what we want students to be able to access to be available on mobile platforms,
mm-hmm.
is increasingly people are doing, we'll call it schoolwork type writing on their smartphones and schoolwork type reading on their smartphones. And we don't know, because nobody has studied this, what the level of sophistication is in the writing compared with what they would have done with a full keyboard on a computer, or heaven help us by hand, or what they would do in reading the same work in print. We have some hunches, but we really don't have any data.
Yeah, it's interesting. It often gets dismissed as doing a sort of media comparison when we talk about the two, but there are very real consequences in terms, with text density and like peripheral reading and things like that, that we understand that there is a difference, let's say with just the size of the screen that you're reading on. But as a linguist,
right. And one of the reasons that the which iPhone was it? The iPhone 6 Plus was such a hit I mean, who thought people were going to carry around this big clunker, right? And you could have a smaller phone. It's because they could abandon their e-readers.
Right.
Because you could now just have one device that you had to carry, or not have to take a tablet because you had just one device.
So, as a linguist by trade, where do you stand? Do you have optimism? Let's just say in terms of reading, and let's, I guess, keep it to an academic sense as well. Do you have optimism there that um, students are headed down this path?
Okay, well, the story gets a little more complex when you look at curricular directions, which are separate from the technology directions, but they end up converging. As a person who's been in the university business for a very long time, it is without a doubt true that faculty members, I'll just talk about the university, but I'll bet the same thing is happening in high schools. And I have some reason for saying that. But let's just talk about universities first. The amount we are asking students to read has shrunk.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question that it has shrunk. If you simply look at the average number of hours of homework that students do a week, there's some figures that have been given from the 1960s, and you can get figures from every 2 years, sets of figures on how many hours students report they have studied come out. And it's gone from something like 45 hours a week of studying, this is outside of class time, to 14 or 15 hours a week, maybe. Well, if you're only doing all of your homework, and if you're lucky, I mean, if you're good, 14 or 15 hours, how much reading can you do? Mm-hmm. So, number one, the faculty have said, all right, read something, even if you're not going to read a whole book. Read something. So we are assigning shorter and shorter things. We're assigning chapters and articles instead of books. That's number one. Number two, because computers do make available, the internet makes available all kinds of wonderful materials, audio materials, video materials. There's some really good stuff on TED Talks and in YouTubes and whatever. Well, if we're taking a student's time to do those, because we think the student might actually do them, because they tend to be more engaging, then if you only are studying a small number of hours a week, there's not much time for reading. So the amount of written text we are asking students to encounter is shrinking. Mm-hmm. Even before you talk about smartphones. Parenthetically, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, but I've got more data since the book was published, plus I've had some other experiences. There are students, again, we're talking about university students, who are reporting that print is boring. So I had a number of students in, what do you like most, what do you like least about reading in print? What do you like least? Print is boring. Okay. At American University, we have introduced a new course for freshmen, basically to orient them to university life, to academic life, to social diversity, and all those kinds of good things. And the readings for this course, when it was in its pilot phase, were in part online, and you read them on whatever device you wanted to, and part print. And what the students reported was the print ones were boring. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there wasn't any real difference in terms of the content as to what was exciting and what was boring in print versus what was available electronically. But there's a growing perception on students' parts that if it's in print, it's boring. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first reason is I read it more quickly, and therefore I'm not as bored. I mean, there seem to be some reasonable evidence that people, given a choice, if you simply say read in print versus read on the screen, take as much time as you want. You're taking less time when you're reading on the screen. And students in my study reported that they read more slowly, more carefully when they read print. Or my favorite was a student saying what she liked least about reading print is that it took longer. Okay. But things are boring also because you can't multitask at the same time. And now that's not so much with the smartphone, but more with the computer where you can have multiple screens open. But there are a whole host of reasons that we're assigning less reading, and we're asking people to encounter information anyway, or ideas to some extent, in other formats because we want to get students' attention. And therefore, if students are even doing what we ask them to do, they're reading less. Look at the enrollments in English or literature departments over the last 15 or 20 years. And it's a steep nosedive.
Mm-hmm.
Students are not signing up for these classes. The classes that are being taught are being revamped, have plays and make your own videos and something that's more enticing. So am I optimistic? Am I pessimistic? I think we can't answer that question without simultaneously asking, what is it we're asking of our students? And to some extent, we're asking things of our students because they weren't doing what we asked them to do before. But still, if the assignment structure has changed and students are reading less, we can't blame it on the phones.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I'll skip around to the third question because we're on the same topic. But so you talk about reading on the prowl and continuous reading, and one of the things I love that you point out is a sort of chunking of reading. So pausing between bursts of reading. So if it is the case that we're going to be implementing this type of digital technology in the classroom, and we're asking students to do these types of, let's say, multimedia reading assignments, do you have other strategies that you can offer to encourage deep reading, especially in contexts where students might not have chosen the reading, but they're being assigned it rather?
Okay, let's start with an assumption that most of us in the Academy have made for a long time, that there are some sizable number of occasions on which students engage in deep reading. We like to think in our classes, we can't vouch for someone else's, but in our classes, of course, we make sure that we teach students how to think through a piece. We teach them how to be critical in a positive sense of the term, in the sense of critical analysis. But in most cases, that's something of a mythology. Students, unless they're in a class that very explicitly, the best way to put it is, you're in a literature class and you say, all right, let's take this line by line, or let's take this concept by concept, and really pulls apart a text. Unless you're doing that, unless you're getting some sense as a faculty member that your students are really understanding what we're talking about, unless they're writing papers that are better than the papers that I'm getting from my honor students, then I think this is something of a myth. We talk a lot these days in the university, and we also talk in K through 12 about how we are teaching critical thinking. Well, critical thinking is somehow packaged in there with deep reading or close reading. But we don't know what we're talking about in most cases when we say critical thinking, and we don't even have any shared agreement on what we might mean by deep reading. The notion of close reading comes from particularly schools of literary criticism in literature classes. It's not what you do in a history class, in a sociology class. In a philosophy class, probably, if it's a well-done philosophy class. But probably outside of literature and philosophy, there are very few contexts in which we ask people to dig into the meat of something. Mm-hmm. Instead, what we do is we say, here are two different articles or books or whatever you convince students to read, taking different perspectives on a phenomenon. Compare and contrast. Okay, when we do lots of that kind of thing. Is that deep reading? No, you pick out one little point here and you pick out a point there and you string them together. And if you know how to write well, you can make it sound reasonably eloquent. But I don't know that that's what has been historically meant by deep reading. It's a term that came from literature.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
So before we say that reading on screen doesn't foster that kind of, or particularly small screens, doesn't foster deep reading, I think we have to at least be clear in our minds what we think, not the gold standard is, but the practice has been.
Mm-hmm.
And the practice is now in reading in print. All right. That said, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the question of whether our experience in reading on screens is spilling over to how we approach print. So, because we're doing an increasing amount of our reading, some of it's on smartphones, some of it's on computers, might be on tablets. We're doing an increasing amount of our reading using a digital screen. Mm-hmm. That in some ways is becoming the default. Just as today, if I say, would you give me your phone number? The first assumption is it's going to be a cell phone number, not a landline.
Right.
So the notion of what phone is has changed. Mm-hmm. Similarly, in some ways, the notion of, did you get a chance to read such and such has become, first, can I get it on a screen? And then maybe I want a print version of it, or maybe I can't get it on the screen, and I'll have to get the print version of it. But I think what's happening is we have a number of reading patterns that most of us have either developed or fallen into in reading on screens, and we are carrying them over to print. So the notion that print is boring, people didn't used to say that. I mean, it may have been boring, but that wasn't their major complaint. But now that you have a way of accessing text that's less boring because you can do other stuff on that same device, it has become more boring in people's minds. Yeah, so similarly, I suspect that because we interrupt ourselves a lot when we're reading on a screen, either because we have multiple screens up or because something is ringing at us, we are expecting that when we're reading in print, we expect to move faster than we did before when we're reading in print, because reading on digital devices is faster than in print. Similarly, when we read things digitally, very rarely do we go back to them again. I mean, we read them and toss them, as it were. And one of the things that's happening with print is it is coming to be increasingly seen as ephemeral as digital stuff is. So take a simple example. More and more students are renting books, mm-hmm. textbooks. And sometimes they're renting print and sometimes they're renting digital, but they're getting rid of it at the end of the term regardless. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have a feeling of staying power, of value, in the way that print that you keep or you potentially keep has had. So there's a certain amount of carryover, I think, that's happening from reading digitally to reading in print. And therefore, if you were to say 2 or 3 years from now, is there going to be a big difference between reading on your smartphone and reading the same thing in a bound book? I don't know. Because when you're reading the bound book, as my students remind me, I can multitask. My phone's sitting right next to me.
Right.
So what do I need a computer screen for? I can do the equivalent of multitask. So there's a change in mindset that I think is important to keep in mind.
Interestingly, your point about the rental textbooks as well, I believe they're instructed to not annotate those books as well. So now you're
instructed means if I annotate it, I'm going to get less money back. I may get no money back because Amazon or whoever I got my rental textbook from has my credit card.
It's a good motivator. So
you're right.
I love this notion of stumbling upon print books as well. So you talk about going through the library and just the physicality of books. And of course, I'm obviously a book nerd myself and pride myself on my bookshelves. And I don't think that's necessarily modern with our students today. But could you talk a little bit just about the consequences of the invisibility of our texts that we read, even and its effect on our ability to remember that, first off, we have even read those things, or
Right.
that we remember what we read that was in them.
Right. So let's just start with that issue of ownership of what we've read. So it could be it's in the library because I couldn't afford it. But I know what the call number is. I can go find it again when I want it. If I actually purchased it, I can remind myself that I've seen it. I can stumble upon it. But even more important than that is a question of valuation. There was a really interesting study that came out. The study itself isn't, the detailed study is still in proof form. It hasn't been published, but there was a summary of it in the Harvard Business Review when it was November or December 2017. And one of the people was at Northeastern University in Boston, I believe. The other may have been at Boston University. And they were business school type people. But what they wanted to know was whether people valued something that was digital more than they valued, or less than they valued, something that was tangible. So they had a couple of different experiments. I'll just summarize them for you, but you might be interested in finding the Harvard Business School article. They had somebody dress up as Paul Revere. Have you ever been in Boston?
I've never been.
Oh, you have to go to Boston.
I know.
Anyway, there's the Old North Church. There was the Paul Revere, the famous writer Paul Revere, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they had someone dressed up as Paul Revere, and they said to visitors to the Old North Church, which is where they put the lanterns, one if by land and two if by sea, and on the opposite shore shall be ready, Paul Revere's ride to say the British are coming, where are they coming from? And they said, we'll take your picture with Paul Revere. And either we'll take your picture and hand it to you with the equivalent of a Polaroid camera, but Polaroid isn't made anymore, but it was a digital self-developing camera where I could hand you the picture right now physically, or I'll email it to you. And then if you'd like to donate to the maintenance of the Old North Church, you're welcome to donate. People donated more for the print physical picture than they did for the digital. That only would be emailed to them. So there's a sense that something physical has more value. And if it has more value in terms of what you'd pay for it, then it may have more value for what's in your mind and whether you want to remember it and think about it and mull over it again. There was another experiment they did with business school students, specifically asking about textbooks. So they said, pretend that you're renting a textbook for your course and it's print, or pretend you're renting a textbook for your course and it's digital. Now let's pretend you have purchased the digital version and that you have purchased the print version. However, you have to know in advance that the faculty member is changing the curriculum and you're not going to be able to sell this to anyone. Well, digital you're not allowed to sell anyway, but print, in principle, you could have sold, but be forewarned, you're not going to be able to have a secondary market for this. And what they found is people were willing to pay more for the print they had bought than the digital they bought. Okay, that makes sense. But for the rentals, print versus digital, they weren't willing to pay much, but they weren't willing to pay any different amount. So that is, they're seeing something that they're not keeping, whether it's print or digital, as not having much value,
right,
and not having any more value because it was print, but you're giving it back, than digital, and you're giving it back. So what that says to me is the mindset of, I don't own it, and therefore it's not mine, and I don't care. Care how? Well, I'll project, don't care, to think about it, to come back to it again. That is one of the things that's changing in higher education, is if you don't keep any books and students keep precious few, is there's very little that's cumulative. In principle, an education in a university or college should not just be some bunch of courses that you have on a transcript. There should be, the reason we have things called prerequisites in some cases. And to be able to go back to something you read last semester or last year is incredibly valuable as part of an education. That is going away. And it's not that we always kept all our books. I mean, people have been selling their books at the end of the semester for a long time, but they were keeping more of them.
Yes.
They're keeping very few now. And this is very American. It is not the case in some other countries, Germany being probably the prototypic example, where you read a book, you think a lot about it, you put it on your shelf, and it's part of who you are. That's also true. The Germans are less mobile than the Americans are, and postage for sending books is very expensive. But there's a mindset these days in the United States that says, I don't keep stuff. We're the people who like experiences, not goods. Another theme.
Yeah, I really appreciated the international sense that you provided in your book on ebook sales and reading rates and things like that. I think it really puts things into perspective, because I really do tend to think just in terms of nationally how we deal, but this is truly
it's easy.
A global.
So I was just in Germany talking with a major book publisher, and the most recent statistic that I have on the sales of ebooks as a percent of book sales in Germany is 4.6%. In the United States, depending upon how you run the numbers, it's closer to 18 to 20% of sales. And that doesn't include any of the self-published books, which is very heavily American phenomenon. In Germany, the students want print. The publisher wants them to want digital because it's less expensive to produce and to distribute, but the students want print. 95% of the books of this particular scientific publisher that does lots of textbooks are print, not because they want it, but because that's what the students are asking for.
Yeah, even here, I mean, I think Pew Internet has done a bunch of studies in this respect where they're asking student preferences for reading, and it's overwhelmingly for print. And that,
generally so.
I get.
There are a few studies that are saying, "Oh, I'd prefer digital," but you have to then ask, well, for which purpose? For cost and convenience? I get it. I mean, my data show that, and other people's data show that. So if you simply ask, what do you prefer? That's a question that has many parameters to it.
Right.
If you say prefer for learning, that's a very specific parameter. So we have to be careful how questions are asked, because there are some data coming out now with students saying, I prefer digital. Okay, but let's talk about why.
Yeah, context is very important. I think my major concern, it seems to me that, just, and this has been worrisome for years for me, but there seems to be just a very strong push at the university level toward digital, even, within the independent bookstores and things like that. When in general, in my experiences, students will tell me that they prefer print, but that they bought the digital or they rented the digital because it was a little bit cheaper, or because it was subject matter they weren't really interested in, and they wouldn't have kept the book anyways. And so, yeah, I have to wonder, I know it's a cost-effective approach for the bookseller, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what we're compromising by doing that. I mean, I do know, but that's what.
Well, it gets a little bit more confused in the following way. In the United States, textbooks are incredibly expensive. Tuition in most places is expensive or obscenely expensive. In Europe, it's people's tax dollars that pay for the universities, because the universities overwhelmingly are public state universities. And the only thing that people may be buying is the books. So if you're not paying or you're paying trivial amounts for tuition each term, then the books don't feel so expensive. So you also have to remember that as a variable. university faculty, when they get it, understand that their students may not have the money. And at American University, we've taken a number of initiatives to help let students know, to help let faculty know, if you're not going to really use a fair amount of this book, don't assign it.
Right.
If the library should have copies so that students can access it because it's a $100 book, and not everybody has the $100, let us know. We have a real awareness that there are students who are not buying the books because they just don't have the money. And then there are the students not buying the books because they don't think it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they had the money, they'd rather spend it on concert tickets or whatever.
Sure.
So the faculty are often going digital because they're trying to be good to students.
Right.
We also, in this case, both administrators and faculty, have this belief that it's what the students want. That, this is the millennial generation, or now we're a millennial and a half, and they do everything digitally, so they must want it digitally, right? Well, no. The reason I did the study that I did, that I report in Words on Screen, is I thought someone has to ask the students what they think,
right,
rather than assume we know what they want, and rather than assume that we know what the best way to learn is. Because we really have very little data on what the best way to learn is. I have my ideas, I know what some of the variables are at work, but almost no serious research has been done on serious learning.
Mm-hmm.
So we know how to do what I call SAT-style comprehension tests, but they tell us almost nothing, because you ask students who are in the psychological experiment or linguistic experiment, call it what you will, to read two passages, one in one format, one in another, and answer some questions. They do what you tell them to. That's different from how people actually read a lot of prose, such as a novel, such as a book in philosophy, whatever. And we have really no research comparing modalities there.
Lastly, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I was hoping you could just maybe touch on, just generally, I suppose, communication technologies as related to addictive communication. I love that phrase that you use in your book.
Okay. So your timing is perfect, because an awful lot is coming out in the news now on just this issue. Let me backtrack a little bit first, and then I will give you the current stuff. Back in 2007, 2008, I did a cross-national study of use of mobile phones. And one of the things that I talked with people in 5 different countries about was, this was university students, why do you text at some points, and why do you talk on your phone at other points? And then just other kinds of things. What do you like most about your phone? What do you like least, and so forth? A number of students, especially in Japan, told me that texting wasn't real communication. And I thought that was an interesting observation. And one has to know something about Japanese society, which is very different from American society or Western European societies, in that there are conventions of politeness for interaction with one another. Mm-hmm. The Japanese language has a very complex set of endings on verbs to mark the level of respect that you show. They're called honorifics for a particular person whom you're addressing. So face-to-face interaction is very nuanced in Japan. So for people to say texting is not real communication makes a lot of sense, because communication face-to-face has lots and lots of nuanced parameters to it that we don't think about so much in Western countries. Okay. Last week, 2 of the major investors in Apple Computer came out with statements that the iPhone is addictive, and you have to do something about that. Mm-hmm. Collectively, it's the California Teachers Retirement Fund, and I think it's the JANA Fund. You can look it up and find it easily. Mm-hmm. They said, we've got $1 billion worth of stock between us. So your shareholders here say you have to do something because kids are getting addicted. And that's the first time there has been such a statement of that sort that I know of. We know that in other countries of the world, particularly in Korea and in China, they have said there's something called internet addiction
Mm-hmm.
or cell phone addiction, and they treat for it. The United States doesn't have an official recognition of this, but ask any child psychiatrist, and they will tell you it's true.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Other things have started happening, namely, I don't know if you've read about the statement that Mark Zuckerberg made,
Mm-hmm.
that he is changing the way that the news feed works on Facebook. Did you hear about this, or do you know about it?
I did. Yeah, there have been a few Facebook. Tony Fadell said something last week also about digital addiction. Yeah, there's been a lot coming out just recently.
Okay.
Just quickly, I wanted to add.
So if you want it, I have the article that I'm sure was the basis for the change in news feeds.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll just give you the reference. You can get it online.
Okay.
Okay, and one of the authors works for Facebook, amazingly enough. Okay, so I'll just give you the reference to it. First author is Moira, Moira, last name Burke, Burke. The second author is Robert Kraut, Kraut. Robert Kraut is at Carnegie Mellon University and has worked for many, many years on the question of how we communicate using so-called computer-mediated communication.
Mm-hmm.
And basically with this article, and this was published in the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, which is freely available online. It was published in 2016. And what it basically says is if you read a lot of general posts that you're not specifically involved with, pressed after you spent the time doing that.
Sure.
But if you're reading about people you know, friends and family, that tends to feel better. So there's a term in sociology, a difference between strong and weak ties. Strong ties are people you know well, you communicate with, you may see face to face, they may be relatives, they may be longtime friends. Weak ties are people that you know of, maybe they're a Facebook friend, maybe you see them once every 10 years, but you're not really close. And what this article is indicating is that when you communicate online in something like Facebook with the people who are your strong ties, you end up feeling different psychologically than if you are communicating or sometimes passively interacting with people you don't know. And there are a whole spate of other things that have come out on Facebook. Is Facebook making us lonely? Is passive use of Facebook detrimental to our psychological well-being, of just reading other things people put up as opposed to posting things yourself? There's a huge literature coming out. One easy place to look is there's an article that came out again in the Harvard Business Review, April 2017. I'll just give you the last names of the authors. It was Holly Shaka, Shakya, and Nicholas Christakis, Christakis. And the article is called "A New, More Vigorous Study Confirms the more you use Facebook, the worse you feel." Mm-hmm. And there's a scientific article that's behind this. You can look it up. But there's a lot of discussion that's been coming out in the popular press now, and is actually changing what Facebook is doing, for better or for worse, by way of saying we're spending an awful lot of time on Facebook, and we're feeling worse as a result of that. That's not necessarily healthy. So maybe we need to do something about it.
That's fascinating. And I do talk quite extensively about social media. I mean, how could I not in the book? But
right.
one thing that I do wonder is I have small children, and my wife and I have made concerted efforts to put the devices away when we're in their presence, so that regardless of what we're doing.
You are so smart.
Well, I write about it.
And therefore you're smart.
I write about it in the book, but my 9-year-old daughter actually wrote us a letter asking us to put the smartphones down, and that really resonated. So we did, and we realized, they don't understand what we're doing on our phones, whether we're emailing or just scrolling Instagram. To them, it's
Right.
just a we're not present. So my question
Right.
was though, I will often find myself I'm standing downstairs in the kitchen at the counter. I
Mm.
was doing it with your book even, but just standing there reading
Yeah.
when the kids are sitting there, and I was just wondering, how is this that much different from me staring at a screen? Either way, I'm still not present, but I'm wondering if one has more value than the other from the child's perspective.
Okay. Well, first, let me just name some names, and then I'll answer your question.
Sure.
Bill Gates and Steve Jobs both restricted screen time for their kids.
Yeah, I read in your book about the school that the
But okay, so
Silicon.
there's the Waldorf School
Yeah.
in Silicon Valley, but Steve Jobs himself with his own kids, and Bill Gates with his own kids said,
Mhm.
"I'm not letting you near these." I mean, what I'm fond of saying is, I know what the trouble is. I do research on this,
Mhm.
or I make money on it, whatever the case may be. All right. So, what is the difference between having your nose in a book and having your nose in your phone?
Mhm.
Your kids know, I am sure, that your phone is an interactive device that can get you to someone away from you and your child.
Okay.
And you're not always on the phone, but they know that same instrument can be used for phone calls.
Mhm.
They know that buzzes come and that you stop in the middle of a conversation and you go read something, that is, you interrupt what the social flow was because this device said, aha, I'm more important. When you have a book, a print book or a newspaper or a magazine, what you're doing in essence is saying somebody wrote something that's really interesting and engaging. One of the things I suspect you socialize your kids in is reading.
Yes.
So what you're doing is you're modeling a behavior that you want your kids to engage in. And it's a static platform. There's
Yes.
nobody who's interrupting. There's nobody popping out of the screen at you. The screen doesn't buzz at you, or the book doesn't buzz at you,
Mm.
Unless it's a book for 0 to 2-year-olds.
Right. Yeah. We have those too.
It's there. It's there to put aside. It's there to pick up. You can't imagine, I assume, having a conversation with a child and then suddenly going to the book and abandoning the child. And then ask yourself what the physical dynamics are
Mm-hmm.
that are different for a phone from a book. When would you interrupt? When would you not interrupt?
Hmm.
Would you look engaged? Would you look interested? Do you laugh out loud? Do you want to share something? Do you take a passage to read to your wife, whatever? And maybe you do that on the phone. But if you're doing something with your children, the question is that a behavior you'd like them to have? So I don't know if I talk about this in the book, but I get really unhappy when we say to kids, oh, you shouldn't smoke and you shouldn't drink and you shouldn't, and you shouldn't text when you're driving.
Mm-hmm.
And then they do that themselves right in front of you.
Exactly.
And we say, oh, when you grow up, well, maybe you'll smoke and drink. I certainly hope not for the smoking part. And drink, I will just leave aside. But please don't text when you're driving. The studies that Pew did, they're old studies now, but I'm sure they're as true today, in fact, perhaps more true than they were before, is that adults were texting more than teenage drivers when they were driving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
so,
is very...
what are we modeling? To go to the question you've asked, what are we modeling? And what are the affordances of the phone? What are the affordances of the book vis-a-vis social interaction with another person who's physically present?
I thought about, and I think about McLuhan in sort of hot and cold media, but I never really thought about the modeling behavior. I think that's really insightful. That's great. It makes perfect sense.
Well, in principle, we try to do some of that in education, right. Including education in the home.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to end it there. That's a really great response, and I kind of put you on the spot for that one. That was good. So,
you know what? That's what I do all
That's
day.
what you do. I know, you're an expert.
On my feet.
Well,
But I'd love to see your book when it comes out. Do you
yes.
have any timeline at this point?
The editor wants the first draft May 1st,
Okay.
so that's got to be the deadline. But I'll be sure to send you along a copy. And of course, as I mentioned in the email, if there's anything in there, I mean, I do talk about you, and I'll reference this conversation. But if there's anything that you'd like changed, just let me know, and I can obviously make those changes.
Um, Unless I said something stupid, you
No,
won't.
no, of course not.
Oh, it's possible.
I just don't want, you never know. So,
well, we try. All right. Well, good luck in finishing. Who's going to be publishing it?
Palgrave Macmillan.
That's lovely. That's really lovely.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And so I'm interviewing a number of experts, mostly out of the literature that I've read, and so you're only the second person I've spoken with, but the first person I interviewed was this guy from Yale, Dr. Greenfield. He runs an internet rehabilitation center in Connecticut for smartphone addiction, even though
even though the official diagnostic guide doesn't say it's an addiction.
That was a long conversation. Oh yeah. So,
yeah.
And I'm avoiding that term for the most part in the book, obviously, but it's been fascinating talking to people, reading about it from people, and I'll be sure to send you along. But thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome, and good luck in your deadline.
Thank you, Dr.
And I look forward to the book.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.